Thank you all for coming. I'm Ruth Van Alstein from Hope at Hand. Hope at Hand is a local nonprofit that provides poetry therapy program for at-risk youth in North Florida. We also host Jack's Poetry Fest every April, which is free of charge and is funded by a variety of arts and culture grants, which we'll talk about at the end of the program. During the presentation, I'm going to be uploading QR and URL codes to direct you to both donation and survey pages. If you have to leave early, I just ask that you download these before you go and visit them. And so now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Michelle, who is going to be leading us today in the workshop. So with that, Michelle, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then get started. So for those of you who might not know me, my name is Michelle Lizet Flores. I am a Cuban-American poet that lives here in Jacksonville, Florida. And aside from being a poet, I'm also an educator, and I run an open mic, weekly open mic out of a local venue here in Jacksonville. So poetry is a really important part of my life, and I'm really excited to be leading this workshop today. I also am someone who's very much interested in all things spooky, scary, a little bit strange and unusual. And so I thought, what better time of year to lead a Gothic poetry workshop than the middle of spring? So thank you all for joining me on this today. And I hope we're able to create some really interesting, creepy, and also beautiful poems. So Gothic poetry. Why this particular genre? I just love the balance that it creates when you think about imagery within poetry. And so today's session is going to be a series of generative prompts. The idea is that each of these prompts will build on each other. So by the end of the workshop, you're taking all these little pieces that we've been creating and you can construct a full poem based off different aspects of this particular poem. We're also going to look at an example of what Gothic poetry can look like. And one thing I want to stress is that Gothic poetry does not have to look like one specific thing. I might have this, Gothic castle here on my slide, but that doesn't mean that that's what your Gothic poem has to be. And hopefully after this session, you realize that there's a little bit of Gothicness everywhere. All right, so for our agenda today, we're going to start with a warm-up. It's going to be an imagery exercise. Then we're going to review some examples of Gothic poetry. Then we'll look at enhancing sensory details within the poem. After that, we'll look at perspective and consider who the speaker of the poem is, the narrator, the perspective from which we are writing the poem. And once we've got all these pieces together, we'll then have some extended time to write and combine all of these ideas that we've created. Before we get started with our first exercise, are there any questions? Okay, looks like everybody is ready. So on whatever note-taking template you are using, go ahead and create some kind of a T-chart. On one side of this T-chart, label it life, and on the other side, label it death, similar to what I have at the bottom of my screen here. Be specific in the imagery that you start to list, and you can make it so that they balance with each other and correlate, or you can just list as many items and images you can think of that correspond to life and as many items and images that correspond to death. However you want to organize it is up to you, but definitely have those two categories. The other thing I'm going to push you on, go for the unexpected. So I think when we think of Gothic poetry, a lot of times we might think of graveyards and storm clouds and things that evoke that very spooky imagery, but try for something different. I'm a Florida poet, so a lot of times I write about swamps and I write about the beach at night and I write about, rotting fruit and things that are very typical to Florida. So think about where you're from and what might be that balance of life and death for you. I'm going to give us 10 minutes for this exercise, and then after 10 minutes, we can start sharing out some ideas. And if you have any questions or want to drop some ideas in the chat, feel free to do so while we begin writing. And at this time, you may begin. Okay, we still have about 2 minutes left, but if you feel like you're at a good stopping point, feel free to pause here. And I would love to hear some responses that you all came up with. So if anybody wants to come off mute or drop some ideas in the chat, feel free to do so. I'd like to hear from at least 3 different people. Go ahead, Parv.
Hi, I found this a really strange exercise. I weirdly came away with a lot of similarities. Life and death. You're born and you die in the hospital. And I think of the white railings of the bed. I think my mother, when she died in the hospital, white railings. And then I think of the white railings. My aunt's got a photo of me when I was born, and that spooked me out in the same hospital. I thought, whoa. And the other thing I thought was, is a famous saying we have in my culture that sleep is the brother of death, because you go to and you don't know whether you're going to wake up. And the other thing I noticed was paradise can be life and death, which is really strange. I kind of went really deep and I thought, well, where are we going, dear? Another thing I found was life can mean a white shawl, bringing home a little newborn, but then white shawl can be bringing a life home. A white shroud can be burying a life. And my head is like going now with ideas. I thought, shall I start writing? But not yet. And then I thought of death before sunrise, after sunrise, and how you can be taken in your sleep. Quite a few people in my family passed away, and I was just thinking back on that, and it just started going intimate and personal. And then COVID, a lot of silent ambulances collecting dead bodies. They didn't make a loud noise because they were elderly folks, so the figures weren't disclosed. They thought the elderly, and then they didn't get much respect, I suppose. Another thing I came was heart disease in the family. Two uncles side by side died of the same condition because they had the same condition. Do you get me? Another one is a mystic predicted it, went on holiday, and the wife found out from a mystic that he would pass away 6 months, came back to the UK exactly to that, and just spooked the sorry, no expletives out of me. Yeah, I think I'll leave the left for writing. Otherwise, all ideas will have gone and I won't know where to start. Well, thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Parv. And I think you hit on some really interesting ideas. So the hospital one, and I saw a few people in the chat note that as well. That's an excellent backdrop, I think, for Gothic poetry. I think especially given everything we've experienced the past few years with COVID and so on. And I've also experienced family illnesses that have led to family members being in the hospital, and yet it is, like you noted, a place of joy. It's where a lot of babies are born, and finding those really intimate moments in the hospital, but it can also create this excellent backdrop for Gothic poetry. And I love that you brought up paradise, because again, being from Florida, I think a lot of people look at the beach and the beautiful trees and all the gardens we have here, and can view it as paradise, but it's got this weird underbelly to it as well. The shroud imagery that you came up with, you have so many wonderful ideas. So thank you for sharing those. Some from the chat that I see, the first sound of the Detroit Tigers baseball, and this idea of springtime and rebirth. From Laura, we have death as the desert, insects, sour milk, ammonia, jellyfish for sure, especially jellyfish on sand. Awesome. And then for life, from Chris, spiders casting webs. And I love that, because when they're casting webs, it's to catch food usually. So that's also like some death mixed with that life, right? Butterflies from Maxwell, sunlight, blood. I love that. Blood is a life force, right? And I see, Babo, you have been waiting. So feel free to share out some of the ideas you came up with as well.
Hey, so I had took this as like a polar opposite type thing. So I would list down one and then give the exact opposite of it. I first started off with like flowers, trees, but then when I thought of the opposite, I went to a rotting wood or like rotting fallen trees. So I switched that to mushrooms, because mushrooms to me represent life, but it's life through death. There's also, like, I use the analogy of the sun, but within the sun being giving us warmth and life, it's also in the cold vacuum of space, which is death. I thought about my dog for a bit, and then I thought about roadkill. Because it's a thing that happens a lot around here. I thought about a crackling fire from like camping or so, and then as well like the aftermath of a wildfire where the land is just desolate and just bleak. Um, yeah, and I thought of like a bustling bookstore. And from that opposite, I thought of something like an abandoned mall, of something that's just like dead, no life is there anymore. So those are a few things that I kind of came up with.
I love the idea of like a dead mall as a Gothic setting. It's very suburban Gothic, right? And it's sort of this commentary on consumerism. And I love a lot of the imagery you brought up that was so unexpected, like space being a backdrop for Gothic poetry. I think oftentimes celestial bodies are sort of romanticized in poetry, but it is a place that as human beings, we would die without the protections we've created, right? So again, some really beautiful, unexpected imagery. The forest fires and the wildfires as well. Those are all really lovely ideas. And so good. It sounds like a lot of us got some really good imagery out of this. The images you've created are going to be the foundation for the poem that we're going to keep building on. So I love where we have started. Okay, so I'm going to go through some quick notes about Gothic poetry, just so now that we've done this exercise, we have a framework from which we can understand it. And I found a lot of these definitions online from different poetry websites. So Gothic poetry is a literary form that combines the macabre visuals of death and decay with romantic emotions of longing, whether it's for another person, place, or time. And that's why I think the dead mall imagery really spoke to me as someone who grew up in the early 2000s. The mall was the place, right? And now it's completely desolate in most cities. The grotesque is conveyed in a way that elicits notions of beauty. So like some of you noted, mushrooms coming up from like a rotting piece of wood, or shrouds that are used for both newborn babies, but also maybe used as at death ceremonies and things like that. In a contemporary sense, Gothic poetry seeks to challenge socioeconomic inequalities on a macro scale. So Gothic poetry can go beyond just imagery and also create critiques and commentaries of our society through the use of the images we choose to portray. And it can also concern itself with the tensions and dysfunctions of various relationships. So in your poetry, you don't always have to focus just on setting, although setting should be a major function of a Gothic poem. You can also look at relationships between people. So here's an example of Gothic poetry by Percy Shelley, and this is the poem Ozymandias. I debated whether I wanted to go super traditional and pick more like an Edgar Allan Poe type of poem, but I really like this poem because I think it does a good job of showing both the imagery that Gothic poetry can have, as well as the commentary that Gothic poetry can have. So I'm going to read this poem out loud, and I want you to consider the following questions. One, who is the speaker of this poem? How would we describe this person? Would we say that this is the poet speaking, or is this a character that the poet has invented? What do you think the intention of this poem is? Why did this poet write this poem? And what mood are they trying to convey? Lastly, how might this poem be different from Gothic poetry in a traditional sense, but also how is it very similar in conveying those same themes? So this is Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, king of kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Okay, so first let's talk about the speaker. How would we describe this I figure within the poem? And feel free to come off mute or drop it in the chat.
I think partially he's a traveler himself, a traveler, but I think there's an implication that this is a person who explores and travels as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Shelley created a backstory for this narrator. So we can tell that this person is a traveler, talking to another traveler, listening to these tales. And based off of that, what mood is the poet trying to convey? As we listened and read to this poem, what feelings, what emotions are coming up for us? I like that idea too, Babo, this person who's on a quest. Okay, I'm seeing a haunted mood. Any other emotions come up for you as you read and listened to the poem? This idea of expansion, yeah, of listening to other perspectives. Okay. And in what ways might this poem maybe differ from typical expectations of Gothic poetry, but in what ways is it also similar? And I see Babo mentioned that this poem gave him a feeling of astonishment, feeling impressed. So would we say this poem is very typical Gothic? Would we say it's different from a traditional Gothic poem? In what ways? Yeah, that's a really good point, Laura. So that's nothing that is traditionally scary. It's not supernatural. There's no ghosts, but there's an emptiness to it. Um, the language is Gothic, so it's very rich, right? They're using their $5 words here. These words are very specific and intentional, but there's also a sense of excitement of getting to explore. Yeah, so it's this sort of visual feeling of Gothic poetry, but in a different setting. It's not in a Gothic castle, it's out in the middle of a desert. Um, yeah, a feeling of inevitability, which is something that Gothic poetry really focuses on, is fate and this idea that it's inescapable. And a lot of decaying imagery, even though this time the decaying is more of a statue and maybe not like plant life or like a building decaying like we would traditionally see. So I wanted to use this as an example because as we jump back into our writing exercises, I want you all to know that you can branch out. You don't have to go for the spooky, scary, supernatural. You can also think about something that is a little bit more grounded in reality, but still implements these ideas of, you know, intense, beautiful language and decaying imagery. So that brings us to our next exercise. I want you to think about the pairs that you've created in your warm-up. And you don't need to use all of them, but I want you to use as many as possible. For each pair, detail the following. So use your sensory details to expand on these images. What do you see? Put yourself in that comparison. What might you hear? What might you taste, smell, feel? I'm going to push especially for senses like smell and feeling, because those are really underutilized in poetry. And then describe in as much detail as possible. Again, go for the unexpected. So oftentimes we might think if we're feeling something in a Gothic poem, it's going to be a really cold setting. Maybe it's too hot. Maybe it's muggy. So really think like, how can you expand and create something different? I'm going to add another 10 minutes to the clock, and then we'll start sharing out in a bit. Y'all may get started.
20 miles.
Okay, I know some of you may be wrapping up, expanding on some of these images, but I would love to hear some examples that you all have created. So if you would like to come off mute or drop your example in the chat, feel free to do so. And I would just make sure we limit it to one image that's been expanded on, just to make sure whoever wants to share out has time to do so. Awesome. So from Laura, we have for some desert imagery, sand. So grit on your tongue, under your nails. I love the specificity of those locations. Rolling dunes, everything looking alike in every direction. Yeah, that's a very disorienting feeling, isn't it? Baking, walking. I love the sounds of those words together. Shards of flaming glass. That's beautiful imagery. Petrified trees. Wind shushing you, scabbing of tiny legs, sifting of sand. And I think the sifting of sand also has this connection to time as well. So that image is working on multiple different levels. This is a great list you've got here, Laura. It's an awesome start. Thank you for letting me know. Let's start with Parv. Go ahead and share out some imagery, Parv.
Hi, mine was flowers, arrival, flowers for departure. Silence into world, silence leaving the world.
Love those pairs. Babo?
Right, so I expanded on my space and sun one. I could feel like the cold of space or like the temperatures dropping and also just the warmth. Also felt like muscle fatigue and weightlessness. You can see the stars, you can experience darkness a lot. You can see I put it in a spaceship, so like I was like the spaceship corridors and things of that nature. You can taste like the skin from your lips as they dry. You can smell burnt wiring, smoke, and you can also still see like your breath in those lighter moments and the condensation upon the glass.
I love that. And I feel like you also have a really nice balance of both internal and external sensations. So things happening within the body, but then the effect of space on the external part of the body. And I love space horror. So I feel like this is going to be the start to a really weird, creepy poem. I'm excited about this. All right. Some other ideas from the chat. Oh, I love, Laura, this idea of writing about what you hate. I agree. I think sometimes when you write about what you hate, it can actually create more intense imagery. So Chris brought up grazes on your knees and hands, stench of iron in the air. Love that. Maxwell has butterflies with tattered wings, that zigzag movement, and then a ticking clock, that steady rhythm. Ooh, I love this from Part of Appetite. Losing and slipping. Let's see. Ooh, an animate relative versus her corpse from Matthew. Veil of smoke. A glass ashtray. Cackle of laughter. There's something about the color yellow too that's coming a lot in this list, Matthew. And I think that has this like denotation of like rotting or withering away. Very nice. Okay. We're going to shift now from these sensory details. And now I want you to start thinking about the speaker of your poem. So who is this person? What is their experience? What choices in life have led them to this point? What joys and pains have they held? Is this person you? Is this person someone else? Is it you at a very particular time in your life? So for this one, let's take 5 minutes. And I really want you to just jot some notes. Who is the speaker of your poem? And y'all may begin. All right, and as we wrap up this perspective exercise, does anybody want to share out who the speaker of their poem is? We'll take a couple minutes to share out. Awesome. So Matthew is the speaker. I love it. So Babo's got a character, the survivor. Okay. Chris is thinking through the emotional journey that this character has taken. Someone who's walked away from life, sacrificed it all, now at a crossroads. Yeah. And I think crossroads are also very Gothic imagery. Oh, I love how Laura has dropped her speaker in the middle of some action. So jumping out of a vehicle, judging herself. She has a newborn niece. So she's clearly going through a very tumultuous time in her life. Again, the more specific you can get with these types of exercises, the stronger your poem is. I love the specificity of that. Okay. So for those of you who did not see, I did drop a copy of the slides into the chat. If you feel free to use them and adjust them as you see fit. We're now going to jump into our final exercise where we put all of this together. So at this point, you have some life and death pairs of imageries. You have expanded on some sensory details, and you've also thought through who your speaker is. Now I want you to start constructing your poems. Put these ideas together. Take your speaker on this journey. What are they experiencing? Let's take about 7 minutes for this, and then we'll share out at the end. All right, guys, I know that some of you are still in the process of writing, so feel free to take your time if you're still writing. But if you have a couple of lines that you've come up with that you would like to share out, I always like to close my sessions with some lines of poetry that you all have created. So feel free to either come off mute or drop some lines into the chat. Parv, go ahead and start us off.
Thank you. This is such a fab session for our sunny Sunday afternoon about death to a Gothic and macabre. Okay, silence like the clouds, hushed, mouth opens, closes like a bud gasping for air. It is invincible. It is invisible, invincible, overtakes angel of death, who snatches like the breath of death. No bells, no hymns, marble headstones, names, dates, flowers everywhere. God is surrounded by pine trees, fresh, cool, aloof, mental, eternal, of life and death.
Thank you. Those are lovely images. Okay, I see we have some in the chat as well. We love crappy first drafts over here, Laura, so do not worry. I'm a big believer in write it first. Revision is where the writing really happens. So screaming, crying, wheels are squealing. The desert sand swallows me whole, choking on grit. I love the sounds in that line. Dunes are laid out like a woven brocade. It's just me and the Beatles. I love that. Yeah, there's some really strong images in there. I love this first start. Awesome. Does anybody else feel like sharing? All right, so from Babo, my blood still floats from where he pushed me away right before the console exploded. Ooh, yes, I love a space horror. We danced within realization. I love how so many of you are also playing with time. We didn't talk about that too much, but I think it's a natural part of thinking of life and death is this relationship to time. All right. And from Carlton, Rollick in the red. Yes, look at this language. At the entrance grows muddier, tiny feet bring shades of browns and grays. I love that. And all but one scramble towards the exit. Beautiful. I lean against an aged oak for strength. I love that line, Chris. Whose sinewy rippling beneath my palm speaks to my weary heart. Love it. Okay, and from Maxwell, desperate for each other's warmth, desperate to chatter. I love the repetition of that. Chatter as birds do. Love it. Beautiful. Well, I really hope you all took something from this workshop, and my main goal is that you recognize Gothic poetry can be anything you want it to be. It's really about focusing on those feelings of life and death, and really thinking about our relationship to those concepts, because all of us come from such different places. What we view as something as full of life or full of death is going to be very different. And hopefully you let some spookiness into your life, no matter what time of year it is. So that was my session. Feel free to contact me. I have my email here if you want to send me a final draft or want to, bounce some ideas with each other. I'm also very active on Instagram primarily. So if you want to follow me on Instagram, it's at Shelly Flowers. And if you are one of the local Jacksonville poets who attended this session, I hope you come out to What's in a Verse tomorrow night. If you follow me on Instagram, you can find information about my open mic. I would love to hear some of these poems performed. All right, and now I'm going to hand it back off to Ruth. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming to this workshop. your feedback matters. And so if you could use this QR code to fill out a short survey, very much appreciate it. And as we were saying earlier,
It's a
without
special
our sponsors, we could not host these workshops or Jack's Poetry Fest, and Hope at Hand could not do their poetry workshops with the at-risk youth in North Florida. And so we want to thank our large sponsors and also our small personal sponsors. And if you would want to be one of those sponsors, this is a QR code and the URL was in the chat. And you definitely, we appreciate any kind of support that you were moved to make. So with that, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I hope you are enjoying all of the workshops. We have another week of workshops coming up, and I hope that you will join us for those as well. So thank you, Michelle, for a wonderful Sunday workshop. I think everyone enjoyed it, and it was really great. So we'll see you later, and
Thank you.
thank you, everyone, for coming.